Thank you. We are back in session, and we'll now move to the last committee of the day, Business Operations, and I'll call on the chair of that committee, Vice Chair Duncan. Mr. Duncan.
Thank you, Chair Davis. Along with Todd Chastain, we lead the Business Operations Committee and have several items for consideration today. The first four are actions on first reading. Biz Op 1 is the approval of contracts for over $500,000. There's two primary considerations here. One of them is, which always curiosity to me, but the German instruction on NCVPS. Apparently Oklahoma State is a center in our country for German instructors because they apparently have an excellent reputation. And so there's a contract to continue for 3 more years, the instruction provided by the Oklahoma State folks. And the second is a bus transport contract with Academy Bus for our residential schools. Are there any questions on those items? I think Tamika Dunn and Catherine Johnston are ready to answer any that might come up. Does anyone have a question on those items? Not hearing any. Let me go to Biz Op number 2, which is a particularly important topic as we think about the times we're in right now. Biz Op 2 is the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Grant. This is an award of federal grant dollars to implement McKinney-Vento and ensure that homeless students are provided a free, appropriate public education. 25 of these grants are reserved for statewide activities, and DPI has typically contracted with the Surf Center at UNCG with respect to those. Then 75% of the funds are awarded to LEAs. There are 58 applicants, and the awards are based in part on the number of homeless students served. A district has to have at least 50 homeless students to apply. I believe we have Dr. Tricia Townsend with us here to tell us a little bit more about that. And I've asked her to provide a little information. I know I've heard a number of comments by board members about what is the status of our homeless student population and what effect is this COVID-19 situation having. And so I know Dr. Tricia Townsend, as part of this report, will try to maybe perhaps lend a little insight to us on that, because I know it's important to all of us. Dr. Townsend?
Yes, thank you so much. I'll be joined today by the state coordinator for the education of homeless children, Lisa Phillips, out of the Surf Center. And so, as you stated, the McKinney-Vento funding supports one of our most vulnerable populations, our homeless students. We owe them our best. We need to really make sure that they have a fighting chance. To that end, the McKinney-Vento Act guarantees a free, appropriate public education for all homeless children and youth by removing barriers. The funding comes to us from the U.S. Department of Education, and for the 2021 school year, it's estimated that North Carolina will receive approximately $2.9 million to support statewide activities as well as these competitive subgrants that we're speaking about today. In terms of eligibility, all LEAs and charters with 50 or more reported homeless students are eligible. And in the event that there are not 50 students residing within that particular LEA, they can come together to submit a consortium application. And in this cycle, we did have one consortium to actually apply. In terms of the grant timeline, DPI tried to provide many opportunities for LEAs and charters to understand that this money would be available to them. There were opportunities presented in March of 2019, and then again in September and October, then again in November and December. We wanted to really make sure that there was a good understanding of these funds and really making sure that there would be an opportunity for LEAs and charters to ask questions about how to use those funds. In terms of the materials available to LEAs and charters, They were available to them to really learn about how to go ahead and complete that application process in CCIP. That was done in both virtual formats as well as face-to-face formats. In terms of reviewing, we had a cadre of reviewers that really understand homelessness and homelessness education. And so those individuals came together and they were provided each application that was made available was actually scored by 3 different reviewers. And so that took place in March of this year. And from that, and we're ready to go to the next slide. From that process, 58 applications were submitted. And within that, as I said, those applications were reviewed and a composite score was actually developed for each of those scores. And in the event that there was too much variance, another reviewer would actually come in and do a review. And so those applications were reviewed in a way that after they were reviewed, that score was actually put into a quality band. And so 90 to 100 would be an application that was rated as excellent, 80 to 89 strong, 70 to 79 weak, 60 to 69, 70 to 79 would be average, 60 to 69 would be weak, and below 59 would be unacceptable. And there were no applications in that particular category. In terms of the tier bands, that funding, there were 5 tiers of support that ranged anywhere from $15,000 to $75,000 in funding. In terms of the applications, there was a good distribution across the various regions within the state. 9 coming from the North Central region, 4 from the Northeast, 7 from the Northwest, 7 from Piedmont Triad, 6 from the Sandhills, 8 from the Southeast, 9 from Southwest, and 8 from the Western region, for a total of 58. We had a total reach of 60 LEAs, with that one consortium being from Perquimans, Martin, and Bertie. Within that number, we had 12 new LEAs to apply for funding. For our funding recommendation, we are actually recommending that all applicants receive funding. So that would be all 58 applications would actually be able to receive funding. We are requesting 19 be funded at the $15,000 level, 23 be funded at the $30,000 level, 5 from the $45,000 level, 5 from the $60,000 level, and 6 from the $75,000 level. And those tiers, I don't think I said this, they actually correspond to the number of homeless students. And so by the time you get to level 5, you have more than 900 homeless students within the confines of your actual LEA. And so at this point, I do have my state coordinator, Lisa Phillips. She's going to give you a little bit of information about how we supported homeless students during this time.
Good afternoon. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for having me on the call today. I wanted to just share with you that the homeless liaisons and LEAs and charter schools throughout the state of North Carolina have really been working hard to support our children and youth who are experiencing homelessness, focusing on areas of safety and ensuring that our children and their families have been able to receive needed services and resources in their communities, as well as keeping them connected to the schools at the time that we're all facing. The work of our liaisons has certainly been challenging, not only with a transient population, but certainly COVID-19. Yet they have been connecting with our students and their families. And while the information I'm going to share with you today is available most broadly on our website, I felt it would be important to give you just a snapshot of some of the unique strategies that are being conducted by the liaisons throughout the state. So if you'll just bear with me for a couple of minutes, I'd like to share with you. Our liaisons have consistently across the state been ensuring that they're checking in with our unaccompanied homeless youth in particular. These are our students who fall in the category of not having a parent or legal guardian with them. They may be couch surfing, living under bridges. They may be in camps. They could be staying with other people temporarily for like a couple of days and then going somewhere else and staying. So those unaccompanied homeless youth that our school districts are identifying, having a liaison connect with them has really been able to provide some consistency for them. And it allows that liaison to really check in and make sure that they are okay. And if there is something that we need, that they need, that we can provide it to them. Some ways that they've been able to check in with our youth in particular, it has been through setting up hotlines for their local school districts that are specific for homeless families and the unaccompanied youth. And so what has happened is some of the districts have set up a separate line so that the youth or the families can leave some details, and that line is only checked by the homeless liaison or some school social workers that have been appointed to support our families that are experiencing homelessness. And it allows them to leave details of where they're at or what their needs are. So that's been pretty unique and very successful. We also know that the Say Something link has, anonymous reporting system has also been used. So that's been very helpful for our students. Our districts are all required to post the educational rates of children who are experiencing homelessness. And so what they've been able to do is take those posters, send them to businesses, particularly our fast food restaurants and where food is being distributed, and ask them to print those out and hang them so that our families and our youth are able to identify who their homeless liaison is and how they can reach them at this time of need. Additionally, there's been some virtual meetings occurring with families, checking in on them, and also working with the community partners when it's necessary to maybe connect a child or their family with services in the community. Of course, our liaisons have been working with their IT departments to look for ways to open up Wi-Fi on school property grounds so that our families that don't have any connectivity devices, that they can maybe come and sit in parking lots and be able to access those resources. Additionally, they've been working with the school nurses to address the medical needs of our students, and also working with our Exceptional Children's Division, counselors, school psychologists, of course, the Title I directors, child nutrition staff especially, and the Transportation Division. I wanted to just point out a couple other things for you to hear. We've been very successful with having local laundromats offer no-cost washing to our homeless families during this time. So many of them are not being able to access some of their typical resources because of COVID-19. And so laundromats have been very welcoming to our families and helping them so that they don't have to pay not only for the cost of washing their clothes, but also to obtain like laundry detergent and things like that. We have worked closely with police departments to ensure that if they meet families out on the street, that they have the resources they need to inform families of how to connect to the schools. And then the nicest thing we've been doing has been providing mentors and mentees for our children and youth, especially our seniors. I've been very excited about this. There's a large set of school districts. Not every district's doing this, but there's quite a number of them that are providing a mentor for our unaccompanied homeless youth, especially those seniors. They have someone that is checking in on them every week, and they're providing a postcard to our students with encouraging words to help them stay connected to school, and also giving them a small little graduation gift. So we're very excited that our children who may not have anyone in their lives and are in the process of getting ready to graduate, they have someone that is supporting them, especially during this time. So we're excited about that. Those are just some highlights of some of the work that we're doing. Trust me, it's far greater than this. And if you have an interest in looking more closely at the work that we're doing, please look at the NCHEP website. And when you see that page, when you open it up, there's a link to COVID-19, and you just click on that. There's for our homeless liaisons, families, and me.
Well, thank you, Lisa Phillips, for that report. So let me ask, does anyone have any questions for Dr. Townsend about the Homeless Assistance Act vote that we will have on this item, or for Ms. Phillips, or with respect to her homeless students' situation as we work through the COVID-19 crisis? All right, not hearing any. Let me do two things. One, somebody needs to mute their phone. It's everybody would check on that. It's a little loud right now. And second thing, I'm circling back. We also have business modernization, and you'll recall, let me try to do a brief summary on this. You will recall that there was the business modernization project, which included the ERP portion, which is to help our local districts change systems, and there's two that's been proposed, Tyler and Cherry Road, and to help those systems then select one that best suited them, and then move forward with business modernization by bringing up to speed the systems that are in place in the local districts, some of which are over 25 years old. So there has been some work done on that, and there was some funding that was already put in place. And the plan that he had approved, that is the overall plan, contemplated that there would be funding on a non-recurring basis voted on for a period of at least 3 years in the range of $50 million a year to allow the implementation of this. Now, what's happened is, of course, there was not funding included for this last year as part of the budget issues that came about during last legislative session. We did not end up getting any funding for this for the 19-20 year. There was still some funding remaining that had been received from the earlier years, from 17-18 and 18-19, and so some work has gone forward. There were some MOUs executed with several districts in August timeframe of last year. Those MOUs did not come before the board at that time. Those MOUs have now been revised and are before the board for approval at this time, and the total amount is well above $500,000, and some of them individually are greater than $500,000. In fact, well, at least one is of a very significant sum. I believe it's over $12 million for Charlotte-Mecklenburg work. The couple of things further on this, that there is funding available to complete payments for this year. These new MOUs, as I've looked at them, the total funding is slightly less than what the August MOU documents were. So it appears there have been some negotiations that have brought about the total amounts down slightly on some of these contracts. We believe that there's enough money, or we've been advised by staff there's enough money to pay the amounts for this year through June 30th, 2020, that is this fiscal year. Whether or not amounts can be paid on the rest of the MOUs in the years following, and whether or not we can continue to initiate MOUs with other districts that would fall in line. This was always set up as a phased process over several years. Whether or not we'll be able to do that is, of course, dependent upon receiving funding. Been advised by staff that these MOUs have a clause in there that would allow the contract, if is dependent upon the fact that there's adequate funding available, and so it's disclosed in the contractual documents. But I think it's important for the board to know, as if we move to pass these, which is before you to do, that we would, in this circumstance, be dependent upon some legislative funding in order to continue to fund and pay these. And it's a very important process. We've all talked about the business modernization process, and the board has certainly been supported by the staff strongly, and the board has certainly indicated its desire to participate in moving forward the modernization process. But it's important to note that we do have, some advocacy to do, if you will, to be able to have adequate funds in a time when we know our economy changed dramatically from what we might have expected it to be just in the last 6 weeks. So I think that's a fair summary of where those contracts are, but I want to pause if there's any questions about them or if anyone wants to add any additional comment. I know Catherine has worked on these, and I thank her for the work on that, and Eric Snyder has worked on, Spano has, and I believe also Ryan Boyce has. I give thanks to everyone for their work on that. Are there any questions about this?
Mr. Chairman, JB.
Yes, please.
Appreciate the background and explanation, and you just said something I just want to clarify. So there's roughly, I didn't do all the math, maybe $18+ million. There's more, I think, than that in here. And you said that there's money available. If we were to approve this, there's money available to handle the first year of funding, but we didn't get any state appropriation. So where does that money come from?
That money's left over from the appropriations in the 2 previous years. Although the funding is non-recurring, it is allowed to carry over. And so, and I believe the math, and if Catherine is with us, and I hope she is, I believe the math is somewhere over $5 million's already been paid out on these to the districts. That was a mistiming error in terms of approval from the board. But there's something like $14 million that still needs to be paid, and that's encumbered funds that exist and are available to pay out the rest of this year, is my understanding. But I'd be delighted to have Catherine confirm what I said as being correct. And I'm using rounded numbers to be clear. Catherine, are you on this call?
Sorry, yes, sir.
Great.
There
Great.
I am.
Did I get that about right?
Very good.
All right.
Okay, so there's money for this encumbered, obligated, and available. The question is just whether there is anything in the out years. And by voting to approve this, we would be acknowledging that there's funding for this first year for these MOUs, but we can't stipulate to future years. And I couldn't find the language, but I certainly trust you on this, that there's clarity that if we don't have new funding made available, that we don't deliver anything.
Catherine, you may want to give clarification and confirmation on that point, because it is an important point in light of the unusual circumstances we're in.
I think you're referring to the availability of funds clauses, and yes, we will make sure that those are clear in all the contracts moving forward, as they typically are.
Right, that takes care of my questions. Thank you, both of you.
Very good. And thank you, Ms. Johnson, for clearing those up. Anyone else have questions? All right, then let's go on to...
Mr. Duncan, I do have one question.
Yeah, please.
So I understand that if funds aren't available, then these contracts cover our responsibility. But what position will our districts be in? I understand that many of them are facing increased cost from current vendors as a result of this, and if we're not able to fund under these MOUs, will the districts be left holding the bag?
May I ask Dr. Spano if he's on the call to address that question?
Dr. Spano isn't on the call today, sir.
He's not? Okay. Let me ask Ms. Johnson then if she can address that question based on information she has available to her on that status.
I wouldn't want to speak to the business owners component of that, so we can make sure we get that information to you.
All right. Well, I think the question is if you have heard from some superintendents that are in the process that they're very concerned about how they will cover the expenses as they go forward. And so I think it would be important to get that information as they are in process. If, for example, we're not able to get the funding that we had believed would be forthcoming and would love to be able to provide, how do we best support the districts that are then caught in a very awkward situation, to say the least. Ones that are already involved and up and going, and even some that were preparing for this, as the chair pointed out, the providers have upped the cost very significantly. That is the former providers, because they realize there is a end of life to what their contract may look like, and there appears to be some maximization efforts that are most unfortunate out of those contracts. And those costs are being districts that are of great concern. So any help we can get, that would be extremely important. It is a very important question as we try to work with and support and collaborate with our partners in the LEAs and the charter schools around the state. Chair Davis, I don't have a more detailed report to answer your question.
Okay, that's fine. That's fine. Thank you.
We're now on, well, unless there are other questions on this Op 3. This Op 3 is an annual report on low wealth and small county supplanting. Specifically under the statute, it's a report that would be submitted prior to May 15th of each year. If there's any determination that counties have supplanted local current expense funds with funds appropriated for small school systems or low wealth counties. And so Alexis Schaus will be with us, hopefully, to report on this, what this report looks like for this coming year.
Yes, sir. So low wealth supplemental funding is approximately $250 million in state appropriation that's allocated to school districts that have a wealth index that is less than the state average, as calculated by the legislative formula. And we have about 74 LEAs that receive those funds. And there is small county supplemental funding, which is $45 million in state appropriations for districts with 3,300 students or less. And we have 28 county LEAs that are eligible for that in 2020. So a county is required to use these funds to supplement and not supplant the local current expense fund. And the county is deemed to have supplanted if the current expense appropriation per student of the county for the current year is less than 95% of the average of the local current expense appropriation per student for the last 3 years. So it is an average of the last 3. And in the event that they are deemed to have supplanted, the LEA is not permitted to receive low wealth and or small county supplemental funds, depending on if they receive one or the other or both. They do have a chance to, once identified, that they can remedy the deficiency, or they can appeal under an extraordinary circumstance that caused the supplanting situation. As Mr. Duncan had stated, we have, as required by legislation, the Division of School Business of the department has performed the annual review of the LEAs that receive low wealth and supplemental or small county supplemental funds, and documented the findings in the report that is in your materials. In the report, you will see that that Graham County supplanted local current expense funds with a total deficiency of $86,734. School business has communicated the finding to Graham County, and the county and the Board of Education are in discussions for a resolution. They're set to meet early next week to determine a final decision on what they will be doing. They are optimistic that the deficiency will be remedied, but in the event that it is not resolved prior to the 2020-21 initial allocations, Graham Public Schools would not be eligible for the approximately $1.9 million in low wealth and small county supplemental funds. So the report documents not only the legislation, but also the current finding. This is not a final resolution, but we are required to report by May 15th. But the outcome might change between May 15th and the allocations for next year.
All right, and just as a very quick point, it's interesting that caused Graham County to have the unexpected balance, and it shows the unique kinds of different financing our schools get all around the state. Alexis, if you just share that for one moment, I think people would find that interesting.
Absolutely. So Graham County elected a couple years ago to include their timber receipts, their federal timber receipts, in their calculation, and so we consistently apply that in the calculation for supplanting. And they have stated to us through our discussions that they had a decline in their timber receipts last year of 70%, and as a result, reduced their local current expense. And that is the situation that they have found themselves in.
Thank you for that sidetrack. I think it's just interesting the various ways our local budgets are constructed, and they're quite variant across the state, as we find in some of these things. Are there any questions on this report, which hopefully will be, as Ms. Schaus has suggested, cleared up before the report actually has to be submitted on May 15th? That would certainly be our hope, but will be submitted in this manner if it cannot be. Any questions on this? All right, not seeing any, let's go on to, or hearing any, let's go on to BizOp 4, which is, again, an action on, which is School Nutrition Equipment Assistance Grants. You will recall that we have these on an annual basis, and they're grants that typically total close to $1 million and allow a number of our districts to be able to obtain some equipment that they're badly in need of that they might not otherwise be able to get. So let me ask Dr. Lynn Harvey, who hopefully is with us, to be able to explain the process of where the grants, generally speaking, are intended to go this year and how they would be used. Dr. Harvey?
Thank you, Mr. Duncan, and good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to bring this item for your consideration today. The 2018-19 federal budget included an appropriation to assist schools in purchasing commercial equipment for use in their school nutrition programs. And as you mentioned, North Carolina's appropriation was just shy of $1 million. Any school that participates in the school nutrition programs under the National School Lunch Act and are in good standing relative to their compliance is eligible to apply for the available funds. Federal regulations do require a competitive application process, so our school food authorities were required to complete an application and submit various support documents to go with the application. The criteria for awarding the grants were pre-established by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and they were required to identify equipment that performed at least one of the following functions: improvements in food safety and quality, increasing energy efficiency, increasing student meal participation, improving nutrition integrity or implementing higher nutrition standards, and allowing for the adoption of innovative meal service strategies. The department for years has chosen to add a sixth function, which is that the equipment should enable the school to use more locally grown, fresh fruits and vegetables. And of course, this year, based on the strategic plan, we also encourage school food authorities to consider equipment that would support innovative school breakfast programs. The division followed the board's policy on awarding discretionary funds. A three-person committee reviewed and scored the applications based on the 6 criteria. And as required by the USDA, preference was given to schools with the highest percentages of students eligible for free or reduced price meals. And for the first time, schools that have never received equipment assistance grants were given priority. Now, this is our 8th time for awarding these grants. And I'm happy to tell you that another round will be forthcoming in the next few months. 38 school food authorities submitted proposals for this round in excess of $1.7 million. Of these, 33 are traditional public school districts, 5 are charter schools. As you review your documents, you'll see the recommendations are listed by education district. This includes the specific equipment requested and its actual cost as quoted in a vendor's bid. Now, unfortunately, there was only one application from District 1, and the percentage of economically disadvantaged students in that application was too low for the application to score well in this round of grants. We've reached out to District 1 and encouraged them to reconsider in the next round. While the review committee would certainly like to have awarded funds to all who requested because the need is great, they recommended those school food authorities shown in the table based upon the ranking of the highest to the lowest application scores until the funds were depleted. So that concludes my report, and thank you for considering our recommendation for distributing the funds.
Thank you for the report, and thank you for the great work of your department as you continue to work to feed our children. We're most grateful to the work of you, your colleagues, and all the nutrition directors around the state.
It is our great pleasure. Thank you.
Are there questions or comments on this particular item? All right, not hearing any, that ends our action items on first read. We'll now move on to 2 more action items. One of them that we have discussed before is the BizOp 5, and this really has 2 items under it. It has to do with the COVID-19 federal funding grant, and as we know, that's the $396 million grant with half of 1% holdback for up to that amount for administration by CPI, and up to 10% holdback by the state educational agency, which would then be put towards, some or all of it would be put towards projects that would benefit the state, if that is the determination, and also take into account other provisions that are contained within the Act. So the first item of the 2 that fall into this action item would be the allotment policy, and let me ask if Ms. Schaus is available to discuss that, and I don't know if Superintendent Johnson wants to address the allotment policy as well, but I will leave it to y'all to decide how to proceed, Beth.
Well, this is Alexis Alexis Schaus, and I will address the allotment policy manual unless Superintendent Johnson has an objection. The item that's being presented to you, it is for action. It has been under discussion. It is in your materials, as well as a estimated planning allotment by public school unit and a summary of the CARES Act as it pertains to the Education Stabilization Fund. This is part of the Education Stabilization Fund as the K-12 relief fund, emergency relief fund of the $396 million. Going through the highlights of this policy, you'll find that the funds are available through September 30th, 2021. All public school units are eligible for the funding. The formula in the law states that each unit is to receive the same proportion of funds they received in Title I, and that is how the calculation in your material is presented. The draft planning allotments are assuming a full 10% that is reserved off the top of the state level. A maximum of 0.5% may be used for administration, and a maximum of 9.5% may be reserved for state emergency needs, for which there is a 60-day window to provide a budget to the federal government. The permissible use of the funds are broad and noted in the 12 statements that is in the policy, and this is from the federal legislation. DPI has 1 year from the receipt of funds to make all subawards to the or the remaining funds will be reallocated to other states. All LEAs or LEAs receiving the funds must provide equitable services to students and teachers in non-public schools as in the same manner as provided under Title I. This is under discussion with the school districts right now and being communicated through the federal programs area. It is a slightly different interpretation than what was initially thought. With Title I, it is only based for those students that are Title I students or students in poverty, and it has got an expanded interpretation for the K-12 Emergency Relief Fund. Units that receive funds are required to pay their employees and contractors to the greatest extent practical. During committee discussion on this item, there was a desire to add 2 provisions from our April presentation of this. One is encouraging units to use the funds to address COVID-19 issues, including re-entry requirements when facilities reopen as instructional settings, including student mental health, sanitation, and supplemental education services. And the second item that has been added since April is that the LEAs are encouraged to utilize, when feasible and cost-effective, state-level convenience contracts to purchase commodities such as electronic devices. So those are the highlights of the policy and will be used to distribute the funds to all public school units. One item I do want to bring to attention as there are continuing questions and comments related to this is that although all public school units are eligible, the funding formula as it is based on public school units that receive Title I funds does not distribute funds to some charter schools that are not eligible for Title I, or they choose to not apply for their Title I funds. And therefore you'll see in your in that planning allotment document that there are some charter schools that have a 0 amount, and that is the reason for that.
Thank you for that thorough explanation. And I think the 2 added in there are important points, and are not to be undersold in any way and to be emphasized. It's reasonable to believe that reentry costs, as we look at the various phases that are outlined and look at the uncertain status of how the virus may proceed in its effect on our schools, there could be very significant expense associated with reentry, and so it is important that schools think in those terms, and certainly think in terms of whatever money is being received here will be extremely important as part of those reentry costs, because I think there could be, the anticipation is there will be very real costs on that. The second point is for joint spending and to the best way possible to combine spending for certain items so that we can get the best possible deals. My understanding at this point that the convenience contracts for devices is through DIT. There's already been, in the state legislation, there was a significant amount awarded to the department for the use on devices. And to the extent that LEAs and charter schools around the state are interested in trying to get devices, it seems as if we could get a larger order put together that we have a chance of lowering the cost in terms of what's paid per device. And in any way we can be effective and efficient with precious state dollars and precious federal dollars in these difficult times, we certainly want to do that. So we strongly encourage as much collaboration as possible and to make maximum use of purchasing power. Same would hold true for what I'll just call generically personal protection devices. We may well have to deal with thermometers. We may well have to deal with masks. We may well have to deal with some personal protective equipment of some sort, depending on where this goes. And so I think we want to be thoughtful about that, and to the extent we're doing any purchasing in that regard, I think we would want to try to maximize our purchasing power again so as to best assist our LEAs and charter schools around the state. So thank you for adding those, I think, provisions that are helpful. And the one question I would ask is the guidance that you're talking about, are we going to not just distribute that to the LEAs, but are we going to, is there any plan to perhaps do some kind of WebEx review for the superintendents and or chief financial officers to make sure we provide as much information as we can on that? Alexis, Ms. Shout.
Yes, sir. So Dr. Townsend and federal programs and myself have been in discussions as to the best way to communicate to the school districts, and we will be providing kind of a more of a FAQ and guidance document on this funding, as well as this funding is the most long-term COVID money that is available. A lot of the state $50 million allocation was kind of the first funding and is due to expire, I believe, in June 30th. And then the funding that is coming through House Bill 1043 has a life really until the end of this calendar year. So this funding is really there for longer term strategy. And so I think school districts, it will be important for them to utilize all those different funding sources to allocate out over the next biennium.
Well, in every way we can support our LEAs on this, I know we want to. Thank you for the efforts that are going to be undertaken and have been undertaken in that regard. Are there questions or comments on this item, which is the allotment policy for the distribution of the federal funding? All right, not hearing any. Let's go to the second part of Biz Op 5, which is, as you recall, we got an application and didn't quite have enough time to review it because thank you to the staff for working so quickly on it, for release of the funds, and have made a few modifications to it, but it's essentially, it's in line with what the department had proposed when they were working very quickly to get something before us. And the application is not making any final determinations on how the funds would be used. That is the 10% funds, but it sets out areas of categories of potential use or how it would be used to assure the federal government that it would be used properly under the guidelines as set out. So we now have that document for you. That's an important process. It's not deemed to be necessarily an overly complicated process, but it's an important process, so that will bring about or trigger the releasing of the funds, and staff advises us that the funds would then be released a pretty short period of time after we get the application in, and then decisions can be made. There's, as was suggested earlier, there's a 60-day period of time for decisions to be made of how to best apply those funds or how to use those funds, and that will require some intensive work, obviously, by the department for their recommendations and by the board in working through it, the priorities. And so that'll be a very important collaborative opportunity to do the very best for our students in these difficult times. So that's also on there under the COVID-19 Biz Op 5 item. That should be in your materials. Does anybody have any questions or comments about that process that is moving forward, the release of the funds, which are local districts I know will have some interest in receiving as soon as they are appropriately available? All right, not hearing anything on that, let me go on then to our last action item of the day, which is Biz Op 6. As board members know, we have worked for some period of time with the board and with our staff, with the DPI staff, who've been very helpful, and I want to particularly thank my colleague on the committee, Todd Chastain, who's been very invaluable in terms of these discussions. Catherine Johnston, who has provided input throughout the process and always been thoughtful and helpful. Ryan Boyce, who has worked on and made some very helpful comments, and of course Eric Snyder, who's also done that. I want to thank all of them for the work that they've put into this effort. So you now have the product of that work. There's a couple of, as you have before you, there's a couple of qualifiers that I think are important to make, and I want to make these clear on the front end. The things that are in here are contemplated as sound, important financial oversight budgetary steps, and things that our staff absolutely believe in terms of the sound budgetary oversight. Because some work is in progress, and particularly, and we've had some discussions about this before, but in particular, among other things, for coding in a more coding categories of expense in a more refined way than the very, very broad categories we've had in the past. And I believe y'all have seen the broad categories, which are not terribly helpful in getting any understanding of how our budget is spent, or the time of what time of year it's spent, for example, more than another time if that's the case, or it's just not very informative. And so our staff is working on, as part of their whole new budgeting process and as part of the work within the department, for better organization and to not be setting up in numerous different silos, but rather have the departments making strong inputs in terms of what an overall budget proposal would look like. Not all that work's going to be put together yet for this budgetary session, and the effort is continuing and ongoing, and progress is being made. But this is sound policy, and we want to put this policy forward. But it's important as a statement to say that not everything in here, particularly with respect to the budgeting and breaking out the categories, can be accomplished yet, because technologically and in terms of getting approvals for the things that are being done, not all of that can be accomplished by June, for example. Some more time's needed. That work is ongoing. That's important work. And this is a good, sound policy for budgetary control and reports. But I do want to say at the same time that our expectations need to be that we want strong reporting. We want reporting that the board understands, because we've heard uniformly from board members that it's been too hard to follow and you don't have a good sense at all. It's very difficult to get a good sense in terms of what the finances are, because of the way it has been, which has been because of the way the state system has been for the most part. And so we want to get better reporting, and the effort here is to do that, and that will, as the year goes on, it will sharpen. We also don't want to burden the staff by making 500 new reports, because that's not realistic at some point. And so it's important that we get the reports that we need. And those have been some of the very productive discussions we've had, and many of the kinds of discussions we've had. I will say this is not an easy policy to work through, and people have been patient and thoughtful, and I'm grateful for that. So this is what we have to present. I would say one last thing, which is we should not be surprised at all if at some point we need to make some modifications or tweaks to the policy as we start to live with it and work with it. That's true about any policy would it be put into place. But we feel this is a very good starting point, and I am very grateful to everyone who's worked on it. So open it up for any comments anyone else would like to make.
Can you hear me? This is Mark Johnson. I'd love to chime in.
Yes.
Thank you. I appreciate your words around this, and I very much appreciate the qualification of yes, let's move forward with this policy, but still understanding that this won't happen overnight. This has been, just one step in the work to improve the Department of Public Instruction. That work has been going on for a few years now, and we know there are policies that were in place, not official policies, but practices. There were practices that did not result in the best support for schools. And I agree with you. I think this is a step in the right direction for making sure that we solidify the best practices in DPI to make sure that there is maximum transparency, maximum understanding of the budgets, making sure directors know their budgets and can plan accordingly for the year with those budgets, and ultimately that the state board can also be able to easily get a snapshot of where funding is going that is supporting schools, and also the public can get a snapshot of that. So I appreciate the work that you have done with the team at DPI to get us started on this path, and making sure that these are things that we eventually start putting into place.
Thank you, Mr. Superintendent, for those remarks. Are there other comments and/or questions on this policy? All right, not hearing any, then let's move on to update on contract. I did not get any comments from anyone on the update on contract. Are there anyone have any about the executed? I'm sorry, to be clear, I didn't get any questions or comments on executed contracts before. Are there any on that? Okay, I did get a couple of questions about the planned contracts report, and so, and I think some of these just may be caused by, as we would all say, things have moved fast lately. There's been a lot going on. One of the planned contracts that was submitted is one that relates to, it appears relates to the contract or a contract with I-Station for the estimated contract of $1,178,000, and I think we have moved past that. I don't think that's still an ongoing likely contract. It was submitted by Dr. Galloway through Dr. Segal, and it was that's what it appears to be. Am I right that this is not now an ongoing project that we're pursuing? Submission
Duncan,
date of
this is JB.
March 17th.
I had read that 1.1 million as the total amended amount, and that included the 200 and almost 50,000 contract we did a few board meetings ago. Is that not what this is?
Maybe that's exactly right. Maybe that explains it. I had not read it that way, so I wanted to make sure we weren't duplicating a contract we'd moved on
But that would be,
from. So maybe this, in fact,
that's just my assumption, that it was supposed to be amended amount versus additional amount, but that would be important to clarify.
That's quite likely the answer to the question, but I did not know the answer when asked. I wanted to raise it. Can someone confirm that Mr. Buxton's interpretation is correct?
This is David. That's my understanding as well. I will confirm with Dr.
Doctor.
Galloway just to make sure, but that's my understanding.
Okay, thank you. If you would do that, that would be very helpful. There are several intents to contract in here, just to raise the issue here, for renewal contracts for providing printing and delivery of the answer sheets to coincide with test books for federal and state mandated testing program. And part of what appears to be contemplated then the class and to grade test, and some of that appears to include for the 2019-20 year. I know there's a lot of active discussion going on that it may be extraordinarily wise to use those tests, not as a testing tool as they're typically used, but to use the 2019-20 test perhaps as an assessment tool at the start of next year to fully ascertain where our students are in terms of moving forward. But I don't know, I don't know that the final decision has been made on that, number one. And number two, I don't know if there's a reason that we would be paying for these testing sheets regardless of whether or not we were going to be given the test this year. And so I have not been able to answer those questions when they've been asked by other board members. Could someone give us some insight on whether, because my first thought is we maybe, before we sign this contract, if it were not ever going to administer the test, we may want to hit the pause button and make sure we're actually going to administer the test for some reason in some way before we purchase the the testing sheets, which are unique sheets, I believe, as I understand it. So can someone shed some light on it to make sure we are appropriately measured in how we go about any of these purchases in light of the unique circumstances, again, we find ourselves in? And I'm sure we are being, but explanation would help.
So, Vice Chair Duncan, this is Tammy Howard. Would you like me to address that?
I would love for you to address it, Dr. Howard. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. So this contract is actually for the printing going forward for 2020-21 school year. And as we may recall, we do have the tests, they were already printed for this school year, the 2019-20 school year. I'm not aware of any final decisions about the use of those tests going forward, other than if they were not used prior to, they would be used for the spring 2021 school year. But this particular contract as well covers other testing needs that we may have, and we are considering perhaps some resources for schools around a re-entry process. And so this contract would help with assisting that as well. So we are looking at what we have done and the impact of that on 2020-21. But the first step really is to get this contract in place, so whatever needs we have beyond July 6, 2020, that we will be able to fulfill those. It's helpful to remember that a contract like this, if the materials are not printed, then there is no invoice that is paid. So we only pay for the tasks that are completed by these types of vendors.
Well, that's a helpful comment, and that comment's a little bit in line with when the question was asked. One of the board members suggested, is this one we wait till we have a more clearly defined approach about how we're proceeding with the use of either these tests or any monies that would be used for these tests. But I think you're suggesting that we would have that flexibility. We would either be able to save the test for another year, or if we don't use the test at all, we would not spend the money, and so that flexibility is already built in. Just want to make sure we don't spend anything on anything we're not really going to use and that we're not committed to. That's really the
right. Absolutely, and we would have the same. Yeah, we would have the same commitment. I apologize. We would have the same commitment to do that. And one thing to also remember is after July 6th, we do move into a new academic year, and none of those assessments have been waived. And so, of course, some of the first assessments that we do is the beginning of grade 3 assessment. So, we're already moving toward that in our processes.
Okay, very good. All right. Those are the questions that I had gotten from board members in advance. I think that happens sometimes, particularly when we're doing it remotely. Are there other questions that people have on any either the executed or planned contract? We're not hearing any. Then the last item we have is the CPI vacancy report. A quick reminder to everyone, this now goes from the 15th of the month to the 15th of the month. And so this is through April 15th. And I was asked to ask one question, I think it's mainly one question, which is, there appear to be February and March on the vacancy report showed 91 vacancies, and then April it went up to 103. And the question was, could someone comment about what accounted for that change that is going up from 91, which had been steady for a couple of months, up to 103. And I think the board has obviously indicated it would love to find a way to close the gap on the vacancies. And we understand that that's not necessarily easy at all times, but nonetheless, the board's strongly supportive of doing that. So someone help the board member with that question to get a better understanding. And probably total vacancies number went from 144 in March up to 157. So that was the other question, was what do we have any sense of why that is, and do we have replacement in the pipeline kind of question is where
Mr.
to
Chair.
the request that was being made. Two people
Mr.
trying to
Duncan?
go, and I don't, yes, that Ms. Johnston?
I apologize. Yes, this is Catherine. I will try to adjust that. As you know, vacancies go up and down throughout the year. In this particular month, we have had resignations as well as transfers. And sometimes the transfers that are just folks moving around in state government, and that's not unusual at all. You will see a little bit of an increase in time to process, but some of that is accounted for because we're filling old vacancies that have been vacant for some time. We have a new recruiter, a new HR director that are working steadfastly to get these taken care of as quickly as possible. And so I know that they are looking at all of the vacancies, and we're working to redistribute the work in the recruitment area. And we're working with Cherie in consistent process with the EY report changes, and we will have a much better, stronger recruitment process within, where I think we've cut down steps to streamline and to try to address the timing and the ability to refill these vacancies quicker, faster, and in a more proactive way for all the divisions. So we're excited about that coming up in the next couple of months. Thank you.
Very good. Please know we're supportive of that by every comment I've heard from board members. So thank you for that report. And again, we stand ready to be supportive in all ways that we can.
Catherine, this is David. Is it still, I think part of the clarification, would it not be that there is a temporary hold on new hiring based on OSHR guidance?
That's a great point moving forward, but that would not have been much of the accounted for that ended April 15th.
Okay.
Thank you.
And the board concern is, does the OSHR guidance get in the way of hiring the replacements from before that time and the other vacancies that are important to fill that already exist? So that was, you may want to say a word about that.
Yes, yes, sir, thank you. We were given the discretion in OSBM to be able to continue with some of those that were in process and considered mission critical with the approval from the superintendent. So we have sent specific guidance out to each of the divisions about those positions that we are going to continue to move forward as quickly as we can for them because they were in the process far along. We didn't want to stop interviews and other critical needed positions that have exceptions that were specifically articulated by OSBM, such as if they are COVID related, mission critical, or considered direct education instruction as well.
All right, thank you for that additional information, very helpful. Unless there are any questions or comments, I want to thank staff members who participated and assisted in this BizOp report, and also thank my colleague Todd Chastain for his work on this, and turn it back to you, Chair Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Duncan. Board members will now vote on any item requiring action from your committee work. A thorough discussion and report was provided on each item, including any respective consent items. I note for the record that Mr. Ford has recused himself from BizOp 2. Please remember that any item on the consent agenda is primarily not complex and may have come to the board for discussion in a prior month. I note also that board members have seen these consent items for at least a week. At this time, I ask if there's a request to remove any item from the consent, action, or action on first reading agendas. Hearing none, I ask for a motion to approve the following. April 2nd, 2020 meeting minutes, April 9, 2020 meeting minutes, April 16, 2020 meeting minutes, April 23rd, 2020 meeting minutes, and the April 30th, 2020 meeting minutes, and EICS 2 through 8, SLA 1 through 4, and BizOp 1 through 6. Is there a motion?
Make a motion, Mr. Chairman, for approval.
Motion by Mr. Hall. Is there a second?
Olivia seconds.
Second by Dr. Oxendine. Any discussion on this motion? Hearing none, Dr. Townsend Smith, will you call the roll to capture the vote?
Yes, sir. Mr. Buxton,
Yes.
Dr. Oxendine,
Yes.
Ms. Chemnitz,
Yes.
Mr. Keenan,
Yes.
Mr. Hall,
Yes.
Dr. Tipton Rogers, Dr. Tipton Rogers.
Yes.
Thank you. Ms. White,
Yes.
Mr. Chastain,
Yes.
Mr. Ford, Mr. Ford, Vice Chair Duncan,
Yes.
Chair Davis,
Yes.
carries.
Motion carries. Thank you. Want to express my thanks to all staff and presenters for this May 7th, 2020 meeting. This concludes our committee work for the day. We do have a few items for closed session. Before we move to that, I'd like to remind everyone that we were scheduled to have our spring planning and work session during this May meeting. And while the full session is delayed, we look forward to continuing our strategic planning and implementation efforts to focus on the aspirations we've outlined and to fully operationalize the adopted goals and initiatives. While COVID-19 has reinforced the importance of our equity and whole child work, we look forward to receiving an update on both our COVID-19 work and our strategic planning committee work in both our June and July meetings. Seeing no new business, I ask for a motion to go into closed session and note for the audience and online listeners that following closed session, the May 7, 2020 meeting will adjourn immediately. Vice Chair Duncan.
I move that the State Board of Education go into closed session to consult with our attorneys to discuss personnel matters and other attorney-client privilege matters.
Motion by Mr. Duncan. Is there a second?
Second, Mrs. White.
Second by Ms. White. Dr. Townsend Smith, will you call the roll?
Yes, sir. Mr. Buxton,
Yes.
Dr. Oxendine,
Yes.
Ms. Chemnitz,
Yes.
Mr. Keenan, Mr. Keenan,
Yes.
Mr. Hall,
Yes.
Dr. Tipton Rogers,
Yes.
thank you, Ms. White,
Yes.
Mr. Chastain,
Yes.
Mr. Ford, Vice Chair Duncan,
Yes.
Chair Davis,
Yes.
carries.
All right, the motion carried. I guess our next step, Dr. Townsend Smith, is to clear the line with the exception of board members and the superintendent. If we could do
Yes.
that immediately and proceed to closed session, that would be great.
Yes, sir. Thank you.